Coming to you from the Forge of Freedom studio in the heart of America. A podcast dedicated to preserving freedom and inspiring personal success. Freedom is born and lives through you, the individual, and it dies in the shadows of tyranny. Motivating our listeners to become well-rounded, freedom-minded people with the body of an athlete, the mind of a stoic, and the spirit of a warrior. The tree of liberty lives on through you, the Forge of Freedom. And now here's your host, Alex Ooley.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to another edition of the Forge of Freedom podcast. I'm your host, Alex Ooley, and this is episode 45 of the Forge of Freedom. Today, I have attorney and firearms instructor Mike Ooley back in the studio for Monday Gun Day to discuss Massad Ayoob's 10 Commandments for Concealed Carry. Welcome to the show again, Mike.
Hey, Alex. Good to be here.
Yeah, so the last few weeks we've been talking, at least for the Monday Gun Day episodes, been talking about the aftermath of self-defense. And this week we're going to start, kind of change directions a little bit and at least start on, I think, Massad Ayoob's 10 Commandments for Concealed Carry. I think we'll break this up into 2 episodes, more than likely. We'll see how far we get here in the first segment of this. But we think these are important because we've talked a lot about handgun selection and what people should look for when they're choosing to carry a firearm, and then also what is required for the justification of the use of force. But there are also some other considerations that people need to take seriously, and I think that these 10 commandments, maybe not all encompassing, but at least are a good start for folks. So, and for those who don't know, Massad Ayoob, we've talked about him quite a bit on the show, but he teaches a well-known class called Mag 40. He also teaches some other courses through the Massad Ayoob group, which is what the Mag part stands for. But he's also written some sort of seminal works in self-defense and gun-related topics. What else would you say about Massad Ayoob, just to give us people a little preface about the subject or the topic for today?
Well, I think in terms of at least non-lawyers, and he's probably the preeminent expert in use of force issues in the United States or maybe in the world, who is a non-lawyer. And he may be at the top or very near the top, even when you include lawyers in that discussion as well. He probably is. So he's a person you need to listen to. This is not a criticism. He recently had a birthday, I think, in one of his blog posts. And that's a good thing. He's got lots of experience over the years. He started carrying at a very young age and has been studying and analyzing this area of the law for a lot of years.
Yeah, it's actually interesting if you hear his story. He grew up, his family owned a jewelry store, and that was part of the impetus behind him learning how to use a firearm and how to judiciously use one if required. So you're exactly right. I think he's one of the top experts on the use of force and self-defense. And if you can take one of his classes, would certainly recommend it. But he's also got some great books as well.
Yeah, and we'll talk about his book maybe not the book, but we'll talk about some of his books a little bit. But speaking of that, I want to give a plug out to an episode you've got coming up in the not too distant future. I'm not sure when, an episode or 2 or 3 from now, something like that, with Stephen Halbrook. And if you don't know Stephen Halbrook, he is a lawyer that's argued cases in front of the Supreme Court. The Prince decision was his. And he's been involved in litigation before the Supreme Court. He's also has a PhD. So incredibly credentialed individual that knows, he's forgotten probably more about the Second Amendment than I know. He has lots of books, probably 10 or 12 books out there. One of them I'm reading now that I think you're going to chat with him about. It's very recent. As a matter of fact, I haven't finished it yet, but it's called America's Rifle, the Case for the AR-15. And I think and he's written some others. My favorite book he's written is Gun Control in the Third Reich. I hope you can see that there. It's a great book as well. But the book I'm reading, and like I said, I haven't completed it, so I probably shouldn't be talking about it. I think maybe you have. But I think it's a very important book at this juncture, given the fact that we recently I had the U.S. Supreme Court decision of New York State Rifle and Pistol Association versus Bruin come out, I think you're going to start seeing some decisions eventually from the Supreme Court, hopefully by next summer, regarding some of these so-called assault weapons bans around the country. And well, first of all, let me say something about that term. That's not my term. That's a made-up political term. I don't know what an assault weapon is. Maybe a lug, your lug wrench on your car is an assault weapon. If you use it as a weapon in a criminal assault, that would be an assault weapon. But anyway, politicians around the country who know very little about firearms have their own ways to mysteriously define this political term. And what it generally means is they're up to nefarious activities and trying to infringe upon your right to keep and bear arms. I'm getting long-winded. But Stephen Holbrook's book is about the AR-15, and I think what it does is it illustrates the fact that the AR-15, probably the most popular rifle in America, it's somewhere close to half of all the rifles out there. There's probably upwards of 24, 25 million AR-15s out there, I think. Read the book, and you can correct me if I'm wrong about that. But I think it makes a great case as to why the AR-15, a semi-automatic rifle, comes under the gambit or protection of the law as espoused by the Supreme Court in New York State Rifle and Pistol Association versus Bruin. So if you want to understand what I think is going to be the litigation coming up and some of the false narratives that you hear in the press about the AR-15 or that you have heard about the AR-15, read this book and listen to Alex's podcast in an episode or two.
Yeah, Stephen Holbrook will be recording that episode later this week. It will be released Friday. I don't have that date in front of me, but it'll be Friday this week. I can pull up the calendar here. It'll be July the 28th that episode with Stephen Holbrook will come out, and that will be about his book, America's Rifle, the case for the AR-15. And like you said, Mike, I mean, so much of the anti-gun narrative is characterized by these sort of it's really a language tool or weapon that the anti-gun groups use to sort of cast certain items like AR-15s in nefarious ways when they're really just commonly used tools for self-defense. And that's really what it comes down to. As we know from the Bruin decision, is it an arm that's covered by the Second Amendment? And it is. Is it one that's in common use? It clearly is. It's the most popular rifle in America, tens of millions of them in circulation. And I think if any arm is protected by the Second Amendment, the AR-15 is one at the top of the list.
Yeah, I can't agree more. And if you, like I said, if you read this book, I think it'll equip you with a greater ability to understand what's going on in the courts, number one. And then number two, it helps you. I mean, face it, at least in my estimation, we're inundated by enormous amounts of propaganda. And all of us that are listening to this podcast, we have friends and family who quite simply don't have the time to invest to kind of cut through all the crap, all the propaganda. If you read this, it'll equip you with some knowledge and information that'll help you educate others without just making conclusory statements. It'll help you use logic and reasoning to bring them to say, I didn't know that. Or it'll just help people understand, I think, rather than simply just name calling, which I frankly have inclined to do sometimes. But it's better to take this approach, be educated, have the facts, and try to bring people along that way.
Yeah, because this is one of the things that's mentioned in the book, and you'll get a taste of this when Stephen Holbrook comes on the show. But the term or the phrase assault weapon was a made-up term with the intention of confusing the general public that doesn't know much about firearms, and to try to use that confusion against the general public to take our rights away. That's not a conspiracy. That was the Violence Policy Center, an anti-gun organization. That was their intention in coining that phrase. And what's great about this book is that he cites the book like a PhD dissertation or a legal opinion. And so he sources this book incredibly well. There are footnotes on nearly every page, many footnotes on nearly every page. So definitely check out that book and keep an eye out for that episode coming up.
Yeah, I can't. Thanks for mentioning the footnotes. I'm always excited about a book. To me, it gives credibility to the author. And Stephen Halbrook, like I said, he has a PhD, and it's written like a real academic treatise at this juncture. It's just footnote after footnote after footnote. When you're reading a book where the footnotes take up as much on the page as the written word, you're probably reading something where the author is not afraid for you to do some extra research and find out if he's right or wrong or not.
Yeah.
So I think it's a great, at least what I've read so far, it's a great book, and I would commend it to everyone out there that's interested in the Second Amendment and the AR-15. Another little thing, the term, there's this assault weapon thing, which is a made-up term. You'll actually learn what a real assault rifle is, which is not an AR-15, a semi-automatic AR-15 that we're talking about in this book predominantly. It started with a German, Sturmgewehr, I think, was the first, quote, assault rifle. The AR-15 is not an assault rifle, and you'll learn why.
Yeah. So we've talked about Stephen Halbrook. We've mentioned Massad Ayoob, two very influential figures in the gun rights community who have put in countless hours and produced lots of content and work to protect our rights. Today, we're going to talk about more in depth a little here in just a moment, the 10 Commandments of Concealed Carry by Massad Ayoob. You just mentioned or have another book here we'll show on the screen if you're watching by video, Deadly Force, another book we highly recommend by Massad Ayoob. He's got contributions in there from some other well-known folks as well.
Well, the reason I have this book out is because, just as a reference, these 10 Commandments, I mean, these are not from God or Moses. These are simply some notions or ideas. You can call them commandments if you want to, from Massad Ayoob. But I wanted to give you a reference. You can look at his book, Deadly Force, Understanding Your Right to Self-Defense. This is the first edition of that book. I understand there's a second edition out. It came out at the end of last year, 2022, I think. My suspicion is the core is all the same. And there may be some additional things on here in the book because there's 7 or 8 or 9, 10 years, I'm not sure, between versions, and the law has changed a little bit mostly in terms of where you can carry, where you can't carry, where we have permits available now and where we have constitutional carry. But anyway, I digress. In this book, there's a section where he really talks about these 10 commandments. And he also tells you where he first wrote these, the articles he wrote them for. So what we're going to talk about from here on out are his 10 commandments. With that said, I want you to look at this book. There's going to be some commentary from us that's added, I think, to the notions that Massad has stated. So if you want the true black letter of the law, 10 commandments that he wrote, take a look at his book. I think we'll have some commentary and some things to add that are based upon our experience. The 10 Commandments Mass wrote about were based upon his long experience and knowledge and study. But I think we'll have a little bit that we can kind of talk about with regard to those. For me, it comes up because we teach classes and we predominantly teach beginners, but there are questions that were presented to us a lot of times, which are things that I have never thought about. But particularly beginners think about these things. They ask us questions, and hopefully we can provide at least some answers or some things for them to think about. Based upon those questions, I think we'll be able to add a little bit to some of Massad's notions or recommendations.
Yeah. And we teach a 5-hour legal class about concepts that we think people need to know if they're going to use a firearm for self-defense, either keeping one in their home or carrying one. So we get a lot of feedback and a lot of questions through teaching that class. And I think that's what you're suggesting, right? That we have some feedback or some thoughts based on those questions that we routinely get through that class.
Yeah. And one of the things that I'll go ahead and start, if you don't care, with one of the commandments. I mean, one of the commandments that he talks about is if you carry, always carry as much as possible. One of the questions we get in class, or one of the things I hear in class is, well, I carry when I think I'll need one, talking about a gun. If I go to a bad part of town or I'm traveling at a certain, whatever the situation. So they have this notion that somehow they know when there's a heightened risk of attack, and that's when they'll carry their gun. Or I'm not sure what the basis of the notion is. Maybe television.
But the thing is, if you think you need a gun, you probably shouldn't go there at all.
Thank you. If you know that you're going to go somewhere and there's going to likely be a gunfight, what do we say? Be aware. Well, if you're aware and you think it might happen, what do? You avoid it. Don't go. So, if you know something's going to happen somewhere, don't go. But the notion is a tool, which you mentioned earlier. A firearm is simply a tool. But to me, it's no different than first aid kit or a shovel or lots of other things, or a fire extinguisher is probably the best analogy. It's like a fire extinguisher. I never hope to have a fire. I never hope to use it. I don't want to use it. But if we have a fire, I have a fire extinguisher and I'm prepared to use it. But the tool, if the fire extinguisher is 10 miles away or 20 miles away and I have the fire in my house, it's not going to do me any good. So this rule is, your firearm, your tool doesn't do any good if it's sitting at home.
Yeah.
You can't predict when evil is going to occur. I mean, you just can't know that. And I don't know why people think they can know that. Like I said, maybe it's from TV or the news.
And there are things you can do to make yourself a less desirable target for crime, but ultimately you're not the one who decides whether or not you are targeted for crime, for a potential robbery or theft or an assault of some sort or a battery. So you have to carry, assuming that you could be attacked by anyone at any time.
Yeah, and keep in mind, I mean, there, like you said, there are places we know where the risk is higher, what we call transitional zones. Mm-hmm. That's the parking lot or the little lobby area between the hotel and the parking garage, or what. There are these places that are obviously higher risk, where criminals are trying to pick a time and a place and a location when victims are not prepared. So,
and where they can get away quickly.
That's why the transitional spaces are sometimes important for the criminals. So,
think gas station parking lots, Walmart parking lots, places like that.
So the criminals are out there trying to find a victim, maybe you, that's unaware and not expecting to need the firearm. And then that's when they'll, do their nefarious act. So that's why it's important that you carry all the time. I mean, for instance, why do you think criminals like gun-free zones? Because they know it's more likely that the potential victims there are unarmed and unable to respond. So that's their job.
I don't have the statistics at my fingertips here, but I'll plug the Crime Prevention Research Center. John Lott, statistician, he has compiled lots of statistics about this issue and other issues, but most violent crimes occur in gun-free zones where where the criminals know their potential victims are disarmed.
Yep. And by the way, what we're saying, if you carry, always carry as much as possible. We're not suggesting not recommending that people violate the law and carry in places where you're not legally permitted to carry. I would suggest to you that if at all possible, avoid the places where you're not legally permitted to carry. But you can't, obviously there's some places you just can't carry. I flew home from Florida. Unfortunately, sometimes where we go in Florida, it's like 16-hour drive. So I have to weigh the 16-hour drive versus going through the Stasi federal government agents, otherwise called TSA, at the airport. But we went through there yesterday. I sat in the airport lobby there, completely unarmed, completely defenseless, relying on a bunch of
untrained,
but I'm
unmotivated. Yeah,
I'm looking for you. Fill in the blank.
Untrained, unmotivated,
just a total incompetent, possible victim. I mean, there's no question about that there. But there's no way I'm going to try to sneak a gun in past TSA. Don't do that. I did travel with a gun in my checked luggage the right way, and everything worked out. But it was in my checked luggage, locked up. Yada yada yada.
And I'll back up here real quickly. I said a lot of crime, or most crime, occurs in gun-free zones. It's mass shootings that occur in gun-free zones, not crime in general.
Yes.
So gun-free zones. The point is, gun-free zones are targets for violence because they know their victims are unarmed in those places, or should be unarmed.
So anyway, if you can carry where possible. Yesterday, part of the day, I couldn't carry.
And it's got to be a habit. Pants on, gun on. That's a common saying in the gun training world. So that you put your gun on whenever you put your pants on.
Yep.
Yeah.
And with this, and we're just on number one now, but with this concept, I want to mention one other thing that's sort of a corollary, I think, that I don't think Massad mentions directly, but we hear this a lot in our training, not a lot, some in our training. And people out there, particularly folks that don't have a lot of training, seem to want to carry without a round, quote, in the chamber, end quote. And I think that sort of goes along with this notion that if you're going to carry, always carry. And if you're going to carry a gun, make sure you're competent and trained and make sure it's loaded. And to me, it's not loaded unless there's a, quote, round in the chamber, end quote.
Yeah.
Go ahead. I think you were getting ready. You had a comment or two about that?
No, I just think that's exactly right. I think that's a remnant of some pretty old training recommendations. And I think it's a training recommendation that needs to go away. If you carry a firearm, you should carry it with a round in the chamber, because those are valuable seconds that you are going to lose if you have to load your gun while you're under attack.
Yeah, and there was a bygone era when there were certain firearms you did want to carry with a round under a hammer, because if you dropped it, it could go off. But that's long time ago. Yeah. Not applicable to modern firearms. If you're not comfortable carrying with a round in the chamber, first of all, if you're not comfortable having a gun, that's up to you. You're an American, do what you want. Pepper spray is a great supplement or alternative to a firearm. But if you're not comfortable with carrying with a round in the chamber, then that means that should be telling you something, that you need to get some more training so that your confidence level can go up, because you can carry a firearm with a round in the chamber completely safely. And there's no reason not to do that if you want to carry a firearm.
So number one, if you carry, make it a habit, carry as much as possible. Number two, of the 10 Commandments, don't carry if you are not prepared to use it. And this is kind of building off of the point you just made. If you're going to carry, make sure it's loaded. But this builds on that. Don't carry if you are not prepared to use it. What does Massad Ayoob mean by that?
Well, I'll tell you what I think he means and what it means to me a little bit, in my opinion. I think we've had people tell us this, or at least me and Doris, my wife. Well, I'm going to carry one, and I intend to use it to scare people off. I don't, and they say out loud, I don't know if I could shoot someone. So that's a person that doesn't need to carry a firearm, in my estimation. With that said, keep in mind that there are an enormous amount of defensive gun uses out there where a gun is never discharged. And it's highly likely that any gun use that you have statistically will not involve the discharge. It may involve simply drawing the firearm from a holster. It may involve pointing it, not even at the perpetrator. That is possible, very possible, and maybe likely. But you need to be prepared to use the firearm if you're going to carry it. And once again, if you don't want to carry a firearm, that's great. Get some pepper spray, or even if you carry a firearm, have pepper spray, in my mind. But that's okay. But if you're going to carry it, make sure you're willing and able to use the firearm. If you have a degree of confidence that makes you unsure about whether you should, you want to shoot, that you are able to shoot someone, even if somebody else's life is in danger, an innocent life is in danger. I think that lack of confidence is something that may be sensed by at least astute criminals. I mean, I think they can sense whether somebody is confident or not, and that may come through in some situations.
Yeah, I think a good resource to point out here, based on that point, is William April's work. He taught a class called Unthinkable that we took a few years ago in Ohio with William April and Greg Ellifritz. William April, unfortunately, has since passed away, but a lot of his work is preserved online. I think David Yamani actually compiled a lot of his work on his website, Gun Culture 2.0, and some of William April's work is also on YouTube. But he interviewed and studied the criminal mind. He interviewed thousands of violent criminals and got into their mind in his work so that he could tell the general public how violent criminals think. And they use this process called thin slicing, where it's basically a heuristic or a shortcut to identify good prey. or easier targets. And they are very good at doing that. And so you want to make sure that you are not identified as a potential victim. And one of those things is through you can do that through training, through awareness, through different techniques. But I certainly encourage you to check out his work if you have the time to do that. I'll link to some of that in the show notes.
Yeah, criminals are essentially what Dr. William April's, some of his work anyway, indicated that basically criminals are experts at identifying prey.
Yeah.
And what you want to do is have the confidence so that criminals are unsure as to whether they're going to be the prey or not if they decide to launch an attack.
Yeah.
And they're just it's amazing. It's actually amazing to me how well they do this thin slicing, an area that I'm not really qualified to talk about too much as a psychologist, but it's amazing how they can identify victims. I think one of his studies is, the numbers are wrong here, but they went to it like a busy New York City street and they asked, let's say 30 or 40 criminals. Do you remember the numbers at all?
I don't.
But they asked 30 or 40 criminals to identify who they thought would be the best victim, and best meaning most vulnerable. Is that what we? That's what we mean.
Who would they victimize?
Who would they victimize? And it was astonishing that I think most of these are hardened criminals over a period of time, all picked out basically the same individuals to victimize.
And I don't know if it's the same study or not that you're referring to, but they also showed these criminals, people who had been convicted of violent crimes, video surveillance that was taken prior to a person being victimized. And it would have a number of people in the video. And before the crime occurred, they would say which of the people in this video is going to be the victim. And with an incredible accuracy, they could pick out which person was going to ultimately be the actual victim.
Yeah. And like I said, I'm talking generally here. I think if folks do some research on Real in April, they'll find these notions out there. I praised Stephen Holbrook earlier for having footnotes and citing things, and now I'm talking to things and can't provide citations. But the bottom line is criminals are experts in identifying victims. And the more that you're trained, it's ironic, sort of, the more that you're trained and able to use violence, but only do it when it's absolutely necessary. But the more able and trained you are, the less likely and confident you are, the less likely you'll have to use that violence to protect yourself or another innocent.
Yeah. So we've gone through the first two of the 10 commandments here. I think we'll go through two more, and then we'll break off the last 6 for a separate episode, a follow-up episode. But the first two, if you carry, make it a habit, always carry as much as possible. Number 2, don't carry if you are not prepared to use it. And then number 3, what's number 3, Mike?
Well, it sort of feeds off the others, but it's don't let the gun make you reckless. Some anti-gunners out there think that folks that carry firearms are somehow, kind of the cowboy image, and, they're out there looking for a fight and looking for trouble. It's this notion, I think Massad mentioned it, that the anti-gunners think the gun pulls the trigger in some fashion or way. But what we want, I think most people are like this, that carry, carrying a gun is just a constant reminder of what the world's like. It's a dangerous place, at least at times. And we don't know when that danger is going to pop up. But as a concealed carry, somebody that has a concealed carry permit of some form, whatever state you're in, or maybe you're in a constitutional carry state, I think it's incumbent upon us that we have a higher standard of care that we adhere to. In other words, if we were talking earlier, I don't, if I think I'm going to a certain area that's dangerous, I'll take my gun. Well, no, as a concealed carry holder or somebody armed, I want to avoid those places. I want to lower the likelihood that I have to use this instrument, this tool. So I think that's what that stands for, that proposition.
Yeah. And thankfully, most people who own firearms are very cautious, and I think, in fact, are more cautious because they own firearms. Just go to an NRA annual meeting. There are 60 to 80,000 people typically at the NRA annual meeting over 3 days, and it's the most polite, the most kind crowd you will ever experience. And a lot of that has to do with the fact that I think everybody knows everyone else is armed, and you're going to treat those people nicely if you think that that they're armed. And I think generally the people that go to that event are also just genuinely good people.
Yeah, I think you're on Paul Lathrop on his Polite Society podcast. I don't want to say what I think that title means, but I think I will anyway. I think what it connotates is a polite, an armed society is a polite society. I think you'll find in years past up in Indianapolis, the weekends where the NRA had their convention there, any kind of violent crime was actually down over the weekend where there were all these folks carrying firearms. So anyway, but it's still, don't let it make you reckless. And I think back to Tom Givens, or other folks say this too. I mean, this higher standard of care applies to us. And essentially what that means is don't do stupid things with stupid people in stupid places at stupid times. I mean, it's just common sense is what it amounts to, I think, to a great extent.
Yeah. And one thing too, I'll just point out, I'll bring up John Lott again in crimeresearch.org. Again, I'll link to this in the show notes, but his studies have found that people who have a license to carry a firearm, and this has nothing to do with the license, by the way. People don't all of a sudden become law abiding just because they have a license. It's just the sort of person that gets the license. But the people who have a license to carry a firearm are overwhelmingly more law abiding than law enforcement. Okay, so law enforcement is a certain degree more law abiding than the general public. And then people who have a license to carry a firearm it was something like 7 to 10 times more law abiding than law enforcement. So it's an incredibly law abiding group, and it's a chicken or the egg question. I think that they're probably more law abiding anyway, but also because they carry a firearm, they're probably more cautious because they're trying to avoid situations where they would need to use that firearm.
Yeah, I think folks that have their concealed carry license, for the most, we'll talk about this later. One of my notes here, I was going to ask you to talk about malum in se and malum prohibitum, but the folks that have that concealed carry permit, they're trying to not violate the law in terms of their ability to carry, which is that law is just malum prohibitum. There's nothing morally wrong with carrying a firearm. As a matter of fact, our right to do so is associated with our human condition, not with government regulations. But nonetheless, we jump through all the hoops, we pay our fees, we do whatever the government bureaucrats tell us so we can get the piece of paper that says we can carry in public. And of course, I'm talking about states that don't have constitutional carry. But because those folks are willing to go jump through the hoops to take care of those bureaucratic check marks or check boxes, I think those people also are folks that are inclined to also not violate the law that has some moral basis to it. Mm-hmm. They're actually people that will do the right thing and not the wrong thing when presented with that.
Yeah, as we all know, or hopefully know anyway, that the law is not an equivalent to moral good and bad or to morality. It's not an equivalent at all. There's, like you said, malum in se, which are things that are wrong in themselves, like murder, like battery, like rape. And then there are things like malum prohibitum, which are things that are wrong just because the legislature has passed a law against that particular act, like carrying a firearm without a license in some states, or going over the speed limit. There's nothing inherently wrong with those actions. It's only wrong because the legislature has prescribed or made a law against it.
Yep.
So that leads us to our next and fourth commandment of Massad Ayoob's 10 Commandments. Number 4 is get a license or a permit. Even if you're in a state that is constitutional carry or permitless carry, go ahead and get the permit for lots of reasons. You want to say a little bit about that, Mike?
Yeah, this has changed over the years. Now we've got lots and lots of constitutional carry states, but maybe all of those states still have a permit process or a license process. Go ahead and get that concealed carry permit from that state, or license to carry a handgun, or license to carry a concealed weapon, whatever they call it in your state. Go ahead and get that for a couple of reasons. Number one, it doesn't bother me as bad to get it now if it's not mandatory. Number one. Number two, that may help you with reciprocity for reciprocity reasons. So when you travel to another state that may not have constitutional carry, they may recognize your permit from, like we're from Indiana, they may recognize that. So there are reasons to get the permit. just to make your life easier, to help law enforcement identify that you're a good guy. Like you said earlier, maybe the law enforcement officer knows if you jump through the hoops to get that piece of paper, you're really a good guy or a good gal. So I think it's a good idea to go ahead and get that. There is some educational benefit. I'm not suggesting that it be mandated at all. Absolutely not. I don't think there ought to be any state mandated training to get a permit. I don't think there ought to be a permit to exercise your Second Amendment rights. I don't think you ought to have to say mother may I to the government to do that. But as a byproduct of it, of you voluntarily doing it, you may in some states learn something from some literature they require you to read or whatever. So it's not going to be as good as what you get here, but there could be some side benefit from that.
There's the moral, like you said, we don't advocate, absolutely do not advocate any mandatory licensing regime. We think that the right to keep and bear arms is a natural right that is simply recognized by the Second Amendment. But the other thing is that from a practical perspective, the states that do have a mandatory license and training requirement, there's no correlation whatsoever between that requirement and violent crime and or negligent or accidental discharges of firearms or harm from those accidental or negligent discharges. Again, I sound like a broken record here. John Lott has a lot of information and statistics on his website about this, crimeresearch.org. I think I've said that 3 or 4 times in this episode. But so not only is it morally wrong to make people pay a fee to exercise a natural right, there's also no practical benefit to that.
Yeah, it's funny. I was in the airport yesterday. We had a delay in the airport, and I was listening to a couple of guys talking about getting their CDL. That's a commercial driver's license. And they were talking about studying and getting ready for it and then going to their employer. And their employer said, hey, you got to pass this test, but it doesn't have any basis in reality or the real world. And you can forget it all. Just got to pass the test. That's all. Yeah. So that's the way government bureaucracy works a lot of times. Yeah. I'm not suggesting to you that you don't. I went through the CDL process. It was sort of BS for the most part, but you do, at least I learned a few things from it. So I don't know. I won't comment on that. I'm not an expert, but typical government bureaucracy.
But I'll just go ahead and mention too, since you brought it up with respect to the CDL, the problem that we've seen is that states that do require training to obtain a license to carry a handgun, it almost creates a bigger problem because people take the minimum training that's mandated, and then they think, oh, I'm good. I've been blessed by the state. I don't need any more training. I'm good. And they're absolutely not ready or equipped or properly trained. So they have this false sense of competency that they don't have.
Well, which I'm going to get into another thing. This is the Forge of Freedom, though, so I can talk about it. But that gets into the whole notion that the state somehow has some omnipotent knowledge to be able to verify that certain folks ought to have a license, be able to cut hair or do whatever. The government, people need to test the assumption that the government has competency in certain areas, I think.
So we've gone through the first 4 of the 10 commandments for concealed carry from Massad Ayoob. I think we're going to leave it there for this episode. Like we mentioned at the beginning of the episode.
Did we go through all?
We went through the first 4.
Okay.
Yeah. So I'll just recap here. If you carry, make it a habit. Always carry as much as possible. Number 2, don't carry if you are not prepared to use it. Number 3, don't let the gun make you reckless. And number 4, if you have the opportunity to get a license or permit, even in a constitutional carry state or a permitless carry state, you should go ahead and get that license. So we'll leave it at that for this episode. Next week, like we said, keep an eye out for the episode with Stephen Hallbrook. That'll be coming out Friday, the 28th. And then Monday, the 31st, we'll be back again for Monday Gun Day, and we'll release the second part of this edition with respect to the 10 commandments for concealed carry. Anything else you want to say, Mike, before we sign off for this episode?
Just one thing real quick. You can put it in the gun or in the notes down below. With regard to that license and permit, that kind of supports this notion that, make sure you know what you're doing out there and don't become a felon because of some law that's not necessarily bound or not necessarily based in any morals, but just a rule. So go to handgunlaw.us. That's a good source to make sure you know what you're doing with respect to that license or permit you have and where you can carry and where you can't, in whatever state you're in.
All right. Well, thanks again, Mike, for joining the show. And everybody will see you again on Friday with Stephen Hallbrook, and then again next Monday for Monday Gun Day for the second iteration of the 10 Commandments for Concealed Carry. Until next time, remember, you are the Forge of Freedom.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Forge of Freedom. Be sure to subscribe wherever you heard this podcast so you never miss a future episode. For more information or to connect with Alex, you can go to forgeoffreedom.com or follow him on Twitter @ForgeOfFreedom. Until next time, remember, you are the Forge of Freedom.